Buongiorno a tutti e benvenuti su nationalgeographic.it. Oggi abbiamo il piacere di avere ospite nei nostri studi, nei nostri uffici, uno dei principali, dei maggiori autori del nostro tempo in termini di giornalismo e di libri scientifici. Parlo di David Quammen, che è famoso soprattutto nel nostro paese per il libro che scrisse nel 2012, fu pubblicato nel 2012, Spillover, ovvero sia il libro che parlava, anticipava la possibilità di una pandemia prodotta da un coronavirus, lo anticipava sulla base delle ricerche scientifiche che David Quammen aveva condotto sul campo, perché il suo lavoro consiste proprio nel fare reportage che vengono dal lavoro sul campo. Oggi siamo qui per fare una chiacchierata con lui a proposito del suo ultimo libro, Il cuore selvaggio della natura, uscito lo scorso anno per Adelphi. David Quammen, welcome.
Thank you. Grazie mille, Marco. It's nice to be with you and nice to be with National Geographic again.
Allora, da dove cominciamo? Io vorrei cominciare intanto parleremo un pochino in italiano, un pochino in inglese, poi ci saranno i sottotitoli. Da dove cominciamo? Io comincio da una cosa di attualità. I will start from something which is daily, right now, is very important. Come va con il prezzo delle uova negli Stati Uniti? How's the price of eggs in the US?
The price of eggs in the US has gone up, and it's starting to go down again, and it fluctuates. Of course, when it went up very quickly in recent months, it had to do with bird flu. And not just with bird flu, with the way we produce chickens in the modern world, in massive farms with millions of birds, industrial scale poultry production. And those big farms are especially vulnerable to bird flu because it can pass quickly among the birds whenever it's dropped to them by a wild bird. And then thousands of birds die, and thousands and tens of thousands more birds have to be killed. And so chicken becomes more expensive, eggs become more expensive.
Allora, il prezzo delle uova fluttua sta aumentando, è aumentato per lungo tempo, è diminuito. Naturalmente questa domanda gliel'ho fatta perché il prezzo delle uova dipende proprio da questa importante epidemia di influenza aviaria che c'è negli Stati Uniti. David Quammen, che cosa pensa che possa succedere? È possibile che anche per la poca comunicazione che c'è in questo periodo da parte poca comunicazione al pubblico, da parte delle autorità sanitarie statunitensi, la situazione dell'influenza aviaria possa peggiorare? Do you think that also because of the lack of communication from health agencies in the US, the situation of bird flu could worsen?
Yes. The problem is severe, but it requires science and support for science, and that is being reduced and eliminated in the US right now, and it requires communication with the public by public health agencies, such as Centers for Disease Control, whether it's in Italy or in the US or in China. There's a need to communicate clearly to the public about what's happening and what the dangers of this particular virus are, and those communications are being disrupted right now. Those communications are being cut off, and it is a very dangerous experiment is to put it politely, that's being performed right now, particularly in the US with public health agencies and scientific support agencies.
Ok, allora passiamo a parlare di questo libro, anche se una delle questioni più importanti, come ormai sappiamo dai tempi del Covid, dai tempi di SARS-CoV-2, una delle questioni più importanti è proprio la nostra relazione con la natura per quanto riguarda la salute globale, che significa salute degli animali, salute della natura e anche salute dell'uomo. Si parla di One Health normalmente, per cui la nostra salute dipende direttamente o indirettamente da quella dell'ambiente in cui viviamo. Allora parliamo del cuore selvaggio della natura, perché questa è una raccolta di articoli, ma non solo una raccolta di articoli, un pochino di più, ci arriveremo piano piano, che David Quammen ha scritto per National Geographic in 20 anni, dal 2000 al 2020, partendo da una delle più straordinarie imprese, probabilmente dell'ultimo mezzo secolo, che National Geographic ha finanziato, che è Megatransect. Let's start with your book now, and let's talk of the first of your reports for National Geographic, which was a long story. It started in year 2000. Well, in 1999, you were called from the editor at National Geographic. How did it start with Megatransect?
I got a phone call in the winter of early 1999 from an editor at National Geographic whom I didn't know, but who now is a dear friend, and you know him
Oliver
also,
Payne?
the great Oliver Payne. This fellow with a British Zimbabwean accent called and said, "Listen, Quammen, we are going to have a great project, a great adventure. A scientist and explorer named Mike Fay is going to walk 2,000 miles across the last great remaining intact forests of Central Africa to do a biological survey of what is there in order to know which areas are most precious for protection. And we want a series of articles, and your great friend Nick Nichols, Nick Nichols, the photographer, will be shooting the photos for this project, and we want you to be the writer. So we want you to walk with this Mike Fay through the jungle, not for the whole 2,000 miles, but for stretches, and then give us 3 stories, a series of 3 stories about this epic journey and its purposes and its accomplishments, but its difficulties, its dangers, its low points, its struggles. So I wrote these 3 stories that became known as the Megatransect series. Mega as in huge, transect as in walking a line through a forest to do a biological survey. The greatest of all transects, the Megatransect. And so I have incorporated those 3 stories into this book. And I walked with Mike Fay through the jungle. We wore sandals and shorts because we were constantly walking through swamps and getting wet up to our waist and up to our armpits. And you couldn't dry clothes and you couldn't wear socks and boots. We just wore sandals and shorts, and we just went through the jungle. And I walked with him eventually for 53 days over a series of sections and wrote the stories.
Era solo la prima storia, 53 giorni o tutto nell'insieme? It was only the first story, 53 days, or overall
no,
your presence?
all 3 stories.
All 3 stories.
All 3 stories were based on 53 days of walking with him over 4 different sections. I would come in, I would meet him at a river crossing, I would join the group, and we would walk across a block of forest for 10 days or 2 weeks, and then we would come to another river crossing or a little airstrip somewhere. And he would be resupplied. His outside assistant would come in a dugout canoe bringing more rice and more manioc flour and more sardines for the team to live on. And then when he left, I would go out with him, and then I would come back into another resupply point 2 months, 3 months later and join the hike again.
Una domanda per forza, perché questa impresa progettata e portata a compimento da Michael Fay è stata un'impresa veramente monumentale. Camminare per quasi 1 anno e mezzo consecutivamente attraversando tutto il Congo francese, la Repubblica del Congo e il Gabon fino ad arrivare al mare. Sei mai stato scettico sul risultato, sul fatto che Michael Fay potesse farcela? Have you ever been skeptical about Michael Fay reaching his goal?
Well, it seemed impossible at the beginning to do this, to say he was going to walk 2,000 miles. And I was there when it began. I was there when he took the first steps. And it was unimaginable that he could walk all the way from the northeastern corner of the Republic of Congo on a zigzag path in order to stay in the middle of the forest and stay away from trails and stay away from roads and stay away from villages and go all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. But I knew enough about Mike Fay to know that if anyone could do this, he could do it, because he was legendarily tough and stubborn and dedicated to conservation and legendarily curious about what was there. So you talk about the heartbeat of the wild. In the chest of Mike Fay beats a heart that is devoted to the wild more than anyone I've ever met.
Allora, Megatransect è stata un'impresa straordinaria, ma non è stata fine a se stessa. Al di là della raccolta dei dati, alla fine di questa incredibile avventura è successa una cosa importante in Gabon, e adesso glielo chiediamo. After Megatransect was not left alone. I mean, it was not just a crazy ecologist crossing half of Africa. What happened after in Gabon? Because that's the political result, which is more important.
And some people were skeptical of this adventure at the beginning. Scientists who said, "Oh, this is a stunt. This is just a stunt." And Mike said, "No, this is for conservation. This is to find out what's there and what needs to be done." And he was right, and he proved that he was right, because having walked through the Republic of Congo and then through the nation of Gabon, he persuaded, with the help of our articles and with the help of a short film that was made, persuaded the president of Gabon to declare 13 new national parks. 13 parks.
13 nuovi parchi nazionali.
Covering some of the most amazing areas that Mike Fay had identified and surveyed. And then, in Republic of Congo, there was one piece of very precious territory called the Guologo Triangle. And it was attached to a national park, but it was not protected. It was a timber concession. But it was filled with chimpanzees, so wild, so remote, that they were not afraid of humans. And after the Megatransect finished, Mike Fay and Nick Nichols and I took Jane Goodall in to that place, the great Jane Goodall, chimpanzee biologist. And we walked with her. We practically dragged her, because she hadn't walked in such difficult circumstances for years. We took Jane Goodall into the Guologo Triangle to meet those uncontacted, naive chimps. And we did a story on that. And thanks to Jane bringing the spotlight of her fame onto that particular triangle of ground, it became part of the national park, and those chimps are protected.
Insomma, questa straordinaria impresa ha portato alla costituzione di 13 nuovi parchi nazionali, hanno portato un personaggio, una personalità di fama mondiale, di statura mondiale come Jane Goodall, di fatto la prima persona che ha studiato il comportamento degli scimpanzé fino in questo triangolo, e sono riusciti a costruire una situazione di protezione per la biodiversità che tuttora è fondamentale per lo stato del Gabon. Are all these parks still on and still okay?
Yes, they are. Yes, they are. They are protected and not just on paper, they are protected in reality. They are protected with wardens and with laws and with enforcement.
Ha nominato gli scimpanzé. Allora passiamo ai loro cugini più stretti, che sono anche cugini nostri, i bonobo, l'altra specie del genere Pan, perché anche con i bonobo ha avuto un'avventura nella Repubblica Democratica del Congo. Come è stato questo incontro con i bonobo, che sono poi forse gli animali più vicini a noi? How was your way to meet bonobos, who are like chimpanzees, yeah. our biggest relatives?
One of our two closest relatives,
yeah.
The common chimpanzee and the bonobo, which used to be called the pygmy chimpanzee. It's a little bit smaller than regular chimpanzees, but it's distinct. And chimpanzees live only on the right bank, the north bank of the Great Congo River. Bonobos live only on the south bank in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So I was asked by National Geographic to do a story on bonobos, working with a wonderful photographer named Christian Ziegler, whom you also know.
I know him very well.
And Christian and I went to these places in remote parts of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And he went to some places without me, I went to some places without him, spent time in the field with bonobo scientists, with a Japanese researcher that I spent some days with in one part of the Congo, and then with two German researchers, Gottfried Hohmann and Barbara Fruth, from the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Primatology in Leipzig, who have studied bonobos in this particular area and elsewhere for 20, 30 years probably at that point. And I saw things about bonobos that they were learning that were different from what the cartoon version of bonobos was. For instance, the cartoon version of bonobos is that this particular chimpanzee is the sexual chimpanzee, with huge sexual appetites and promiscuous sexual activity of all sorts. And they don't fight. They have sex, make love, not war. Whereas other chimpanzees can be very dangerous
and very aggressive.
And very aggressive, and they fight wars. Different groups of chimpanzees fight wars against each other. Among the things that I saw was a group of bonobos hunting ferociously as a group for prey. And they did not seem like the sweet, lazy, sybaritic, love chimpanzees when they were chasing a flying squirrel that they wanted to eat. And this was with the Japanese researcher that I was with. And it was very exciting. We followed them as they followed this potential piece of prey, this poor flying squirrel. And eventually they cornered this squirrel up in one tree, and they were clawing up the tree and going for the squirrel. But because it was a flying squirrel, it took off and went and glided away to safety.
Una delle cose che sorprendono forse di questo libro, rispetto a quelle che normalmente sono raccolte di articoli, è che al suo interno c'è prima di tutto un'enorme coerenza, e poi coerenza perché porta a un pensiero complesso, un pensiero sofisticato, e piano piano ci arriviamo, ma poi contiene tra l'altro, e adesso glielo chiediamo, i semi di quello che è tutto il suo lavoro e anche di quel libro che è stato Spillover. E ritorniamo indietro a questo aspetto che nasce proprio dal primo capitolo, dal primo racconto di Megatransect. I was saying that what's somehow surprising of your book is that being a collection of articles, it shows a great coherence, and it takes you to an overall view of biodiversity and of ecosystems. But I want to make a step back, because with your first work on Megatransect, you also met, I think, one of the things that you loved more in your life, and one of the things that drove you to write Spillover, which is Ebola virus.
Yes. Yes. Well, I don't know if you'd say it's one of the things I
love. So I know one of the things you loved for going to Congo was I wanted to understand what was there with Ebola.
Yes, yes. One of the sections of forest that we walked through, Mike Fay and I, was a block of forest in northeastern Gabon called the Minkebi block. And it was famous in the medical literature because there had been an Ebola outbreak in 1994 on the eastern edge along a river in a village called Mayabut II, Mayabut number 2, Duo. And people had gotten very sick after having eaten parts of a chimpanzee that was found dead in the forest. Some boys went out hunting. They brought back this body of a chimpanzee. Hooray, we're great hunters. But it turned out they had not killed the chimpanzee. Chimpanzees are eaten for food in different parts of the Congo still. They had not, in the Congo Basin, they had not killed this chimpanzee. They had found it dead. They brought it back to the village. People divided the meat. They ate the meat, and without cooking it properly, without cooking it thoroughly. And dozens of people got sick from Ebola. I think eventually 30-some people died of Ebola. This had happened just on the edge of Minkebi. So we knew that Ebola was in Minkebi. Now, a virus has to live in an animal. Viruses cannot replicate themselves except in the cells of cellular creatures, and the viruses that affect humans come from wild animals. Ebola lives in a wild animal. Which wild animal? We still don't know. We didn't know then. We still don't know. Some people say bats, maybe, maybe not. It's not proven. So we walked for 10 days through this forest knowing that the Ebola virus was in an animal somewhere around us. Maybe in a bat, maybe in a monkey, maybe in a rodent, maybe in a spider. We didn't know. We walked for 10 days, and this focused my attention on Ebola. And I realized as we did this that the question, the mystery of Ebola, where does it live, what animal does it live in, and how does it pass from that animal into humans, and how is it possible that an animal virus can also infect humans and make us very sick? I realized this was all about ecology and evolutionary biology. It was simply the ecology and evolutionary biology of viruses rather than the ecology and evolutionary biology of bonobos or lions or elephants, the things that I've been writing about. And when I realized that, I realized I can write about this. I can write about the ecology and evolution of scary new viruses. And that became my book Spillover.
Così Spillover è nato anche da questa, anche forse soprattutto da questa avventura nella foresta del Congo, dove appunto poco tempo prima c'era stata una piccola epidemia di Ebola che arrivando da non si sa bene quale animale serbatoio aveva contagiato gli abitanti di un villaggio. Tra l'altro nel libro si raccontano anche alcune aree che erano rimaste praticamente completamente spopolate di gorilla e che segnalavano la presenza di Ebola nelle foreste che loro hanno attraversato. Però io vorrei passare adesso a un'altra parte, perché la parte probabilmente quella più importante, è la riflessione a cui si arriva alla fine, e cominciare parlando di un'altra avventura, di un'altra storia raccontata qui da David Quammen, che è quella del Gorongosa National Park in Mozambico. One of the stories you wrote, I think one of the most successful stories is the story of Gorongosa National Park. So in order to reach the overall view we started talking about, let's get in Gorongosa National Park in a difficult country like Mozambique. Mm-hmm. How is it and how is it managed, how it has revived?
Again, National Geographic, the editors there, asked me to go to Gorongosa in Mozambique and write a story about this national park, which has been restored after having been devastated and destroyed during the Civil War, the War for Independence and the Civil War that followed in Mozambique, former Portuguese colony. And what was special about this is that it was a park that was being restored in a partnership between the Mozambican government and Mozambican people and scientists and an American millionaire named Greg Carr, who is devoted to two things: to conservation of biological diversity, partly because Edward O. Wilson was a great influence on him, and on human rights. Human rights, going back to the earliest ideas of human rights, which he traced to a Chinese philosopher whose name I don't remember, and to Euripides, to the plays of Euripides. Ancient idea, human rights, individual human rights. So he's devoted to these two things, human rights and the conservation of biological diversity. He is invited to bring his millions of dollars and help restore Gorongosa National Park. The wildlife has been devastated. Animals have been eaten up during the war. The infrastructure has been bombed because the rebels used Gorongosa as a hideout. The elephants have been killed to sell their ivory to buy ammunition. He comes in and works with Mozambican scientists, and they restore this park, bringing back the elephants, bringing back the leopards, bringing back zebras, but also, and equally important, bringing back livelihoods and benefits to the people who live, the local people who live in the buffer area surrounding the park. Along the borders of the park, there are villages, and a total of about 200,000 people live in these villages. And so Greg Carr and his partners arranged that this national park would be restored, yes, and it would have boundaries protecting the animals, but it was not just a matter of locking out the people and arresting them if they tried to kill an animal for food. It was a project to bring benefits to those people so that this national park would be the best thing that ever happened to these people surrounding the park. How did he do that? How did these people do that? With programs in the schools. Keep girls in school. Let them get educated. Don't let them be married off at the age of 12. Let them get educated and go off and have jobs or improve their ability to make a living. Help people with their agriculture. Give agronomy help to all of the farmers in this area. Enterprise, small-scale enterprise. Coffee planting, shade-grown coffee planted on the sides of Mount Gorongosa, where they restored the natural forest and they plant coffee underneath it, and then the park helps people harvest the coffee and make a profit. Health clinics, a number of things. So they established this synergy, this combination of benefits for the wildlife, for the biological diversity, and for the people. And it was a privilege to write about this because I think it's one of the best models of conservation in the world.
È questa la stessa filosofia di African Parks, che è un'organizzazione che gestisce parchi in altri paesi dell'Africa? Is this the same philosophy of African Parks who manage different other parks in different areas in Africa?
Yes, there's also a chapter on this organization, African Parks, which it's actually quite different from Greg Carr and his partners in Gorongosa. African Parks works particularly in areas where governance is not powerful, where there are still civil conflicts going on today, where there are rebel groups like the Lord's Resistance Army in western Uganda and eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo, which has threatened a national park called Garamba, one of the parks that African Parks now runs. So what this organization does is contracts with governments, the government of Democratic Republic of the Congo, the government of Chad, a number of governments in Africa. They contract to protect and manage national parks for the government. And they bring in highly professional, highly trained, and well-equipped rangers for protection, for enforcement of laws. And they bring in some benefits for people in the surrounding areas, but they're just really beginning on that. They're not as far along as Greg Carr is and his partners in Gorongosa. So it's a different model. It's some people say, well, it's militaristic. Well, that's just an adjective. It is serious about enforcement. And African Parks does not make the laws about these national parks. The countries, the sovereignty of those countries determines the laws. African Parks helps to enforce them.
Yeah. So, arriviamo così a chiedergli il significato del titolo di questo libro, perché poi è da quello che si arriva alle conclusioni. Che cosa significa appunto, che cos'è il cuore selvaggio, la natura per David Quammen? We go to the title of your book. What is the heartbeat of the wild?
The heartbeat of the wild is, let's call it an emergent property. It is something beyond the sum of its parts that exists in ecosystems when they are large enough, intact enough, and diverse enough to support the full complement of native animals, plants, organisms of all sorts. And as I say in the foreword of the book, there are certain necessities to have an ecosystem that really has a beating heart, the heartbeat of the wild genuinely in it. If you put a tiger in a zoo, the tiger is a dangerous animal, but the tiger is not wildness if it's contained in a zoo. It's an educational individual in captivity. Wildness is when you have a tiger in a large area of forest, for instance in Nepal, and you have all of its prey, and you have all of the native plants, and you have all of the microorganisms and the small creatures, and they are interacting with one another through the processes, the ecological processes, predation, herbivory, parasitism, competition, photosynthesis, decomposition, all of those processes. So if you have an area that's big enough to support tigers, it will support also lots of smaller creatures. If it's intact, so it's not broken into pieces, so animals can move throughout this ecosystem. So it's big enough, it's intact, and it has biological diversity. If it's big enough and intact enough, and you have saved the biological diversity, it will have diversity. And then if you have succeeded in saving those things, you will have these ecological processes. And I identify those as the four elements of an ecosystem that really has a heartbeat. Sufficient size, sufficient connectivity, sufficient biological diversity, and the processes that connect all of the biological diversity one with another.
Nella prefazione che ha appena menzionato parla di una delle massime personalità del XX e del XXI secolo dal punto di vista della conservazione, forse il padre di certe teorie della conservazione, che è Edward O. Wilson, e mi viene in mente che Edward Wilson ha pubblicato un libro, è stato pubblicato un suo libro in Italia, in cui parla di lasciare metà della terra alla natura selvaggia. Ci sono progetti da parte delle Nazioni Unite e da parte di organizzazioni non governative per lasciare alla natura o per proteggere almeno il 30% delle terre emerse e degli oceani entro il 2030. Quali sono, vorrei chiedere a David Quammen, gli ingredienti fondamentali per riuscire ad avere successo nel limitare il nostro impatto sull'ambiente? I was mentioning in your preface, you were talking about Edward O. Wilson, who was a great master for you, and I think for every one of us. And I mentioned the 30 by 30 initiative of the United Nations and some non-governmental organizations. Which are the most important things to reach these goals and to lower the impact of human beings on wildlife?
Well, let me take the second first. To lower the impact of human beings on wildlife, we have to think about two things. We think about the size of the human population, and we think about consumption. And human population size multiplied by consumption is what yields impacts on the natural world, losses to the natural world, losses of biological diversity. So it's not just population size, it's how much people consume. Some people say, well, there's this family in Africa and they have 8 children, that's too many. Well, those 8 children of that family in a village in Africa are consuming less than 2 children in a family in the United States under most circumstances. So you cannot simply demonize people for the size of the families. People should think about whether they're going to have children, and if so, how many, but also how much they consume, how much they waste. Gasoline, food, other things that we consume, all of which yields our imprint our footprint on the natural world. Now, in terms of how we...
That's why we introduced the overshoot day.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the day we consume all the renewable resources that are built by Earth in 1 year. Yeah.
Yes. Right. Yes. And it's what yields our big problems: loss of biological diversity, climate change, and emerging diseases. Those three big problems all come from human population size multiplied by consumption. Now, Ed Wilson, who was a great friend to me as well as a great influence on me, wrote a book called Half Earth, suggesting that we should set aside half of the Earth to protect nature. That was ambitious. The United Nations has adopted, and a number of countries in international agreements have adopted the goal of 30 by 30. Try and protect 30% of the surface of the planet for nature by 2030. It's a goal. It's artificial. It's aspirational. It is a goal, and it's a worthy goal. It's an important goal. I'm involved with an organization called Rainforest Trust. I'm on the board, and we give money, other people's money,
yeah.
the money of generous people who trust us to give it for the protection of habitat in different parts of the world. We think about 30 by 30 also all the time. But it's not just enough to say, okay, we've created a new national park. We draw a boundary around it, and we've protected 2 million acres, and we can add that to the 30 by 30. What happens once you've created that park? What happens once you've drawn that line? What happens to the wildlife inside and to the trees inside? Are they thoroughly actually protected? That's as important as being able to say 2 million acres. What happens to the people surrounding that area? Are they still starving? If they're starving, what are they going to do? Are they going to go into that park and kill animals in order to feed their children? You have to think about all of that. And 30 by 30 are just two numbers that help us remember that we have a lot of work to do in order to achieve this.
Quindi alla fine qual è il messaggio finale del tuo libro? What is the final message of your book?
I hope it's hopeful. Writing about projects such as Gorongosa and Greg Carr's efforts there, and the work of Chris Tompkins in South America with her group, Tompkins Conservation, and with African Parks. I hope it's hopeful at the end to say, to show people that this can be done. This is not easy, but this is hugely important to save biological diversity, to reduce our impact on the natural world, to keep that heart beating inside these ecosystems. It's hugely important. It's not easy, but it can be done. There are ways to do it.
Un'ultima domanda a David Quammen, perché va fatta. In questo libro c'è il lavoro di 20 anni per National Geographic. Tanti giovani magari che si accostano al giornalismo, il giornalismo scientifico, sognerebbero qualcosa del genere. La domanda è naturalmente come si arriva a scrivere per National Geographic e a fare questi reportage. How can someone dream about being a reporter as you have been for 20 years for National Geographic? What does it mean? How hard it is?
I would say if you wanted a life like I've had, and I've had a very privileged life, traveling all around the world to wild places for National Geographic, and for other magazines, and for researching my books like Spillover and Senza Respiro. If you think that would be enjoyable and satisfying, then don't think about being a writer for National Geographic. That would be great, or being a writer for the New Yorker magazine, or being a writer for La Repubblica. Think about, am I deeply devoted to being a writer? Do I want to write? Do I want to create stories with words on paper? If so, do it. Work at it. You can publish yourself in a blog. You can work for small magazines and newspapers before you work for large international magazines. But what's important is not who you write for. What's important is that you write and what you write. And it's not an easy life, but if it's what you really want to do more than anything else, then it's possible to work your way to the privileges of the sort that I've had.
E quindi che cosa faceva David Quammen prima di lavorare con National Geographic? What did you do before work and writing for National Geographic and other magazines?
I published my first book in 1970. What is that? 55 years ago?
So young, a child.
55 years ago. Because I knew I wanted to be a writer, and I started as a novelist. But then after a few years, I realized I couldn't make a living as a novelist, and that I was more comfortable and more satisfied writing nonfiction about the natural world, because I was always interested in the natural world. So I turned into a magazine writer, writing about the natural world, and then I also started writing ambitious books about the natural world, all nonfiction. So I haven't published any fiction since 1987. And now I write about the natural world. But it took me a long time. I was a starving young writer for 13 years or so before I got much reinforcement. But I knew this is the only thing that I really want to do. So I'll keep doing it, whether or not I succeed.
E anche questo messaggio, anche David Quammen ha fatto la gavetta e ha fatto fatica, ma poi è riuscito a costruire una storia, una carriera con reportage per le più importanti riviste del mondo e con un numero di libri che, ricordiamo sempre Spillover, ma anche Cuore, selvaggio, della natura e Senza respiro, Il predatore alfa, tutta una serie di libri pubblicati in Italia che hanno lasciato un segno nella storia del science writing nel mondo. Grazie David.
Grazie mille Marco.
Thank you for staying with us.
I'm glad to be here. I always love coming back to Italy.
E per noi è un piacere che tu torni sempre. Thank you again.